Breaking news tonight. Bone-chilling Bryan Kohberger details emerge. Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. Thank you for being with us.
Bombshell, a new tell-all book, reveals a bone-chilling theory on Idaho murder suspect Bryan Kohberger. Author Howard Blum joins Crime Stories for an exclusive interview.
Howard Blum is joining us right now from Manhattan, along with an all-star panel to dissect what we know and what we are learning from Howard Blum. You know, I have pored over every document, every search warrant, every return, every witness statement that I could get my mitts on. I have flown to Idaho, to Moscow, Idaho, in the midst of winter and trudged through the snow to look at the scene as best as I could, to drive the route. I believe, oh yeah, good times, freezing. Then got in an SUV at night in the pitch dark. At the time, I believe, Bryan Kohberger left that crime scene and started his circuitous route, although an hour's drive to his apartment at nearby Washington State University in Pullman, which should have been about an 8-minute drive. And somewhere along the way, he turns his cell phone back on. That said, after all that, I still learned so much from reading Howard Blum's book. The name, When the Night Comes Falling, a Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. Wow. Even the title made me stop. And in the midst of everything we all do in regular life, you know, working, your children, your cat, your dog, your mom, I managed to finish this book in one day. I practically could not put it down. I had it in 2 forms. I printed out what I had and had it on my iPad so I could look at it no matter where I was. Howard Blum, it's amazing. You had me sitting in the Costco parking lot in the heat, reading your book, trying to get to the next chapter before I came back home. It's amazing.
Well, I appreciate that. That's very kind. You sit in a room as an author, and you wonder if anyone will read what you write, and then to hear someone talk about it so graciously, I'm very flattered. So thank you.
Well, I've never been accused of being kind before, so I will take that with a box of salt. I want to get right to it. There's so much in your book. I had to take copious notes. So I'll just start at the beginning. It was an amazing intro, and I was struck by the fact that you start your book from Kohberger's father's point of view. And what I learned about his father really touched my heart. How he never got to go to college, and he was so proud of Bryan Kohberger and was already referring to him as Dr. Kohberger amongst his coworkers. And it reminded me so much, Howard, of my father, how he didn't get, we're first generation college. And when I got through law school, in his mind, it was the most amazing thing ever. So proud. Right? Now, here's my question with that lead up. Almost at the beginning, his father and his family, Kohberger's family, suspected him of being the killer. And I found that just, I was dumbstruck. Because, you know, when I read about a crime, I don't immediately think, oh, my son did that. In fact, I've never thought that. Tell me your thinking and why you say that.
Michael Kohberger makes this trip out to see his son to make the ride back with him. You know, this is a 28-year-old man, and his father is worried about him. He's making this trip. It's fatiguing, it's expensive, but he's worried about his son. He's sitting next to him in this car, shoulder to shoulder. He knows the police are looking for a white Hyundai. And one of the first things he realizes when he meets his son is that his son's mood is volatile. That's his first sign that Bryan is in a state. He goes out to meet his son in Washington State, and he doesn't know which Bryan he's going to encounter. But that's his first sign, and he begins to see as the moods change and become deeper and more acerbic. He begins to wonder, oh my gosh. He begins to think the unthinkable. He begins to consider that his son could, in fact, be a murderer. And all this is building in his mind. And he's afraid to go there, as any father would. But he's getting these clues as if he were following footsteps in the snow. And the footsteps are becoming bloodier and bloodier. And he now realizes, could this really be true? And then all of a sudden they're driving along in Indiana and they see police sirens in the back and the car has to pull over. And he begins to feel, what is going to happen next?
Wow. Guys, with me, Howard Blum, who has literally written the book. The name of the book, When the Night Comes Falling, a Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. And I have learned so much, more than we, the public, have learned, more than my sources have told me, by exhaustive research by Howard Blum. You're looking right at him. Howard, you stated that these aren't your words, that you discovered this from what Kohberger's father stated to other people. What did he state about immediately suspecting his son was the killer?
He went out to Idaho, Washington State at the beginning with suspicions. You have to remember that Michael, this is not his first trip out there. He even took his son out on the first trip in August when his son was just registering for school. He had real concerns about his son.
Joining me an all-star panel in addition to this incredible author, Howard Blum. Howard, I noticed that one of the points of contention was about the route. And when I was driving that route from the King Road murder scene back to his apartment in Pullman, I was wondering why he did that, why he drove an hour in the middle of the night. And I'm sure you know there's no street lights. It's pitch black. I nearly ran off the road a couple of times when a semi would come by. But he basically did the same thing with his dad. The dad flies out, does a quick turnaround. He's exhausted. He gets in the launcher with his son. And the son refuses to go the direct and much shorter route. Do you think that had anything to do with Kohberger believing he was being followed or monitored?
I think Kohberger, being a criminology student, was trying to take precautions. At this point, I don't think he had any belief or any knowledge that he was being followed. However, he was trying to be circumspect. He was trying to be one step smarter than the authorities.
Again, in addition to Howard Blum, now preeminent author, an all-star panel. And I want to go out to Chris McDonough joining us, the director of the Cold Case Foundation, former homicide detective, host of The Interview Room on YouTube, who, like me, like Howard, has seen the evidence, has walked the scene, very familiar with the area. Chris McDonough, you've had a lot of homicide cases, and very often family members know their son is a killer, but they will never admit it. And I'm thinking about Kohberger's dad, who knew he had suspicions at the beginning his son was a quadruple killer.
Yeah, and Nancy, I think what happens is, right, that parental, tendency kicks in relationship to they want to believe it, but they don't necessarily want to believe it, and so it's kind of a tug and pull from a parental position. However, in this particular case, it's obvious Dad had his radar was way up and had taken that trip to go out and pick up his son. So that in of
Well,
itself tells
think
us
about it,
potential.
Chris. And let me throw this to Dr. Angela Arnold, a renowned psychiatrist joining us, AngelaArnoldMD.com. Have you ever seen parents that tiptoe around their child, that they're just
all the
waiting
time.
for an explosion? And when I was reading the first chapter in Howard's book, When the Night Comes Falling, you could feel the tension of the father in the car with Kohberger on this long drive, just waiting for an explosion. But we got to keep in mind the dad, Michael Kohberger, had spent his whole life trying to prop up, support, help Bryan Kohberger. So he knew it was like walking through a minefield. Anything could make him explode. And when Kohberger insisted on this circuitous route, which took hours and hours longer than a direct route, he went, okay, fine, you're the boss. Those are the words the father used to Kohberger.
Well, sure, because Nancy, the last thing he was going to do was confront this guy, because I have to wonder if the father knew all of this, was the father a little bit terrified of what could set Bryan off? And possibly was the father's life in danger at this point, because apparently Bryan was agitated at this time? I wonder if the circuitous route had anything to do with some sort of OCD kind of disorder that this guy has.
Howard Blum, you also described Bryan Kohberger, his heroin habit, how he got into heroin, and when he managed to kick heroin after his father turned him in for stealing the sister's phone, and he had to go into some sort of a rehab, a treatment to get his life straight. He kicked heroin and decided his body was a temple, and that is when he became a vegetarian. And I had wondered where that started, because now he's demanding certain types of meals behind bars, and he's getting them. And I remember an anecdote where the family couldn't cook with certain pots and pans because they had once cooked meat. I'm working up to it. You reveal that Kohberger had 2 types of plastic surgery after he loses 100 pounds. What were they?
Well, Bryan Kohberger is intent, and this is the admirable part of him. He's trying to reinvent himself. He comes out of this depressing hardscrabble existence, a family with 2 bankruptcies. He's going to a hardscrabble high school. His father is a janitor at the high school. He's sort of embarrassed by that. He becomes a heroin addict, and yet, to his credit, he works himself out of this. He then he's trying to approach girls at high school. They're ignoring him. He loses the weight, and he still has this sort of flesh that's going over his midsection. And it's just not the sort of guy he wants to be. He wants to be a player. He wants to be one of the cool guys. And he thinks, so he has this surgery, these 2 surgeries are covered by insurance, and he reinvents himself. He's in good shape, as you can see in the photographs. He works out, he does martial arts, and he still tries to become the man he wants to be. And yet, at the end,
Plastic surgery.
Yes.
The plastic surgeries.
He has these 2 plastic surgeries to get over his midsection, so there's not this sort of envelope, like the lid on an envelope.
Howard, you're so polite. Okay. You outline it in your book. He had 2 surgeries, one of them being an abdominoplasty, and the other, you know what, they're long. Let me rephrase, Liz. You described 2 plastic surgeries that Bryan Kohberger has. Both of them, I believe, were related to removing flaps of skin left over from the 100-plus pound weight loss, a flap of skin and tissue that went down over his private parts and his lower stomach. He wanted to get rid of that. And when he did get rid of that through plastic surgery, he had a serious buff body, is the way I take it from your book. Is that what happened?
That's exactly what happened. He had this vision that he would become a new Bryan Kohberger. And the tragedy is he almost succeeded. he gets out to Washington State a new man, and he's trying to live a new life, and yet he's pulled back in to what he always is, to his essence, I believe.
Bryan Kohberger allegedly enters the home and walks past the first rooms he sees coming into the Moscow, Idaho house and goes straight up a narrow staircase and turns directly into the room of his target, Madison Mogen. Author Howard Blum says investigators believe Maddie Mogen is the target and her best friend Kaylee Gonzalez is killed because she's in the room with Mogen.
Did Bryan Kohberger's parents suspect their son? An explosive new book suggests family knew more than they ever let on about their troubled son. Author Howard Blum tells us more.
Guys, joining me is the author Howard Blum, author of When the Night Comes Falling, A Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. Howard Blum has gone where many have not, tediously investigating everything about this case, and the book is full of revelations. We were just describing how Kohberger's own family thought at the get-go, before he was ever named a suspect or even a POI, person of interest, that he committed the quadruple murders. And in this vein, can you imagine Kohberger's father, so proud of his son getting his PhD, flies out to Washington to drive Kohberger back home to the Poconos area for Thanksgiving. And he's sitting there for all these hours in this white Elantra, which of course he knows has been named in the case, and looking over at his son, who is acting more and more volatile. But I want to move on to the next point. Listen.
In a shocking revelation, author Howard Blum claims Bryan Kohberger is not a random spree killer. He had one target in mind the night he allegedly killed 4 college students in their home off campus in Moscow, Idaho. Blum says investigators believe in a non-targeted attack, the killer would have stopped at the first door inside the house. It would have been instinctive to go into the first rooms after gaining entry, but that isn't what happened. Investigators point to the 2 surviving roommates, Dylan Mortenson and Bethany Funke, as proof Kohberger is after a specific target.
You know, you really back your theory up with a lot of facts, and the way they're laid out, it makes perfect sense. But all along, it has been believed, it has been accepted that Kelly Gonzalez was the target, the original target, and the others were just collateral damage. But you say no. Why?
Well, at this point, Kaylee is not even really living in the house. She's living up north with her family. She's going to graduate at the end of the term in December. And Bryan really wouldn't have come in contact with her necessarily. But he did go to the Mad Greek restaurant, which in downtown Moscow. It served vegan food, which he liked, which he would adhere to strictly, and Maddie was a waitress there. And my belief is that they encountered one another in the restaurant. Were any words said? Did they have a conversation? I don't think that was necessary. You know, both the prosecution and the defense have said for the record that there was no interaction between Bryan Kohberger and any of the victims. But Bryan was a man whose life was sort of determined by obsessions, determined such as being addicted to heroin, such as losing 100 pounds, such as deciding to become the best student after being a mediocre student. And I think once he saw Maddie, for whatever reasons, I mean, she's an attractive blonde woman, charming, vivacious, ebullient, he becomes interested in her. And I think his fixation, he would see the parties, he would be in, I believe, on the periphery of events as parties were hosted at this house on King Road, a party house, and he would look at that and he felt it was in some ways a constant rebuke to the life that he was leading and the life he wanted to live. He could never be a part of that. And he decided in his rage and his mania, I believe, to do something about it. Kaylee is collateral damage. The two other victims are collateral damage too.
Near the beginning of your book, you talk about Bryan Kohberger delving into, quote, the criminal mind, and will be a, quote, scientist exploring why criminals do what they do. It's been kicked around that his motive, not that the state needs to prove a motive, they don't, but juries like to hear it. So practically speaking, you better hand one over on a silver platter on top of the Christmas tree. You can't have him full of rage and methodically trying to carry out the perfect murder and get away with it very calmly and methodically. So, which one is it? What about it, Blum?
He was filled with mania, which is not the same thing as rage. And you're trying to understand, make a rational explanation for completely irrational acts. What Bryan Kohberger tried to do that night is to commit, I believe, the perfect crime. I believe he wanted to get Maddie, he wanted to kill her. And then once he gets into the house, once he finds another girl there, all his plans fall apart. That's why he leaves the knife sheath behind. He did think things out. As the police well know, there wasn't any blood, a trail of blood left by the perpetrator in the house. All they had was the touch DNA on the knife sheath. There was no trail of blood going up the hill or where a car was parked. To this day, they have not found the murder weapon. To this day, they have not found any clothes covered with blood from that house. And the house was filled with blood. We've all seen the pictures of the rivulets of blood leaking out from the foundation of the house. So he did have some planning. He knew enough, he thought, to turn off his phone from 2:47 to 4:48 for those 2 hours when the murders were taking place. And
Hey, Howard Blum. You're the fire hydrant. You're giving me the information faster than I can take it in. I can't drink from a fire hydrant. You've got to give it to me teaspoon by teaspoon. And I'm telling you, this book, amazing. But Brian C. Stewart joining me, high-profile lawyer joining us, who practices in this jurisdiction as well as in Utah. Brian, I hear what Howard is saying. I hear what Joe Scott Morgan is saying. And I've got to agree, I empathize. I get both the theories. The reality is the state never has to prove a motive, but jurors want to hear a motive. So do you believe that when this case goes to trial, which it is, despite the defense dragging their feet and dragging the judge along with them, he's going along with it, do you believe the state has to pick a theory as to motive? Because these two were not consistent. Or are they? Rage versus method.
Well, motive can be an important part of the circumstantial evidence that leads a jury to understand why a perpetrator commits a crime. But as you said, it's not necessary to prove that they committed the crime. Here, where Bryan Kohberger seems like somebody who's studying criminal justice and perhaps sees himself as the smartest person in the room or a narcissist, his motivation may be to commit the perfect crime, and he would know that choosing someone in another city who he doesn't have a relationship with would create a lot of distance between him and the potential victim. That's the first thing that police look for, is relationships in a murder. And he might have chosen Maddie as someone who's young and blonde and beautiful and might get him a lot of notoriety as he evades justice. And so if that's his motivation, that could certainly be the reason why he chose somebody and doesn't have necessarily rage for Maddie, but has rage for the system, or mania, as Harold says, to beat the system.
Joining us, Howard Blum, who has meticulously investigated so many facts of the case that we didn't know about, including Kohberger's past, how he lost 100 pounds and had 2 different plastic surgeries to remove a flap of skin from his stomach that went down over his genitals. He didn't want that look. He lost 100 pounds on his own, had 2 plastic surgeries to reinvent himself as a modern-day Adonis. But, according to his friends, what I'm reading in When the Night Comes Falling, his friends didn't like how that transformation changed his personality. He became a know-it-all, very aggressive, and that was borne out at Washington State University. He treated his friends in high school that way after he got his new look. He became, in his mind, the it guy, but somehow he couldn't pull it off. What, if anything, did that have to do with the murders of 4 beautiful University of Idaho students? Okay, to this whole panel, including Howard Blum joining us, I've got to have more than what Joe Scott Morgan is telling me, that the attack on Kelly was much more savage than the attack on Maddie Mogen. Why? All 4 of them were brutally stabbed dead. I need to know who is my target. And in this book, Blum describes a blood trail. He also describes the blood literally leaking down the outside of the house, which I observed when I went to Idaho. But that's it. Let's talk about the blood evidence, Howard Blum. What about the blood evidence convinces you as to who the real target was?
Well, one point that you just made about the wounds on Kaylee being so severe. Kaylee fought back. She was originally in the bed with Maddie. She gets up from the bed. The room is very narrow. She tries to get towards the wall, but she's trapped by Kohberger, and she's fighting back, and she is not dying easily. It's a very violent death, and he's enraged that he even has to, I believe, that he had to encounter her. He did not expect her. And to then find this woman fighting back like a tiger is putting him in his mania, is exacerbating the situation. He thought he would go in there and kill Maddie, her presence rebuked him. I think that's what was going on that night in that house.
Nancy?
I'm trying to take it in. Yeah, jump in.
So there's a couple of things, from my thought process in this. One is, that evening, Kohberger, I don't think he's manic depressive or in a manic state in any way, shape, or form. My personal opinion. I think he's very organized. He selected his target set on purpose. And the reason I feel that way, there's a couple things. One is both Madison and Kaylee, they're attached at the hip. And that evening, when Kohberger pulls up, if he's our guy, he's got to see her car. He's got to know, based on the surveillance that he's been doing, that she potentially could be there as well. And so we have to now ask ourselves from an investigative analysis.
I disagree because I don't know that Kohberger knew about her new car, a Range Rover.
Okay.
That was new, and it's a used vehicle.
She was living there. At this point,
Howard?
At this point, Kaylee is not really living in the house. She's living in Coeur d'Alene. She just comes in for that weekend, and he didn't know that. He didn't expect it. And when he's circling the house, I believe, he's not really doing that night 3 times. He comes and goes. I believe he's not doing surveillance. I believe he's trying to find the will inside himself to turn off the motor, to stop the car, to climb down the hill, and to commit this crime. Each time he circles the house, it's not to see what's going on. He doesn't even really notice the cars, but it's really an internal battle he's fighting. If he had seen the cars, if he'd even seen the DoorDash delivery, there was a DoorDash delivery at 4 a.m., he might have reconsidered it. He was locked in.
Yeah, hold on, everybody. Hold on. Howard Blum, you were taking our program down a pig path Now, I guess you joining us from Manhattan that you have never been down a pig path. But what a pig path is certainly not a direct line or goes in any organized manner. It just goes all over the place. But you know what, Howard Blum? That's the way an investigation is. When I would sit around a table talking with investigators and witnesses, other DAs, one topic leads to another topic, leads to another topic. And it's hard to marshal your evidence, which you did a great job in your book doing. But guys, he brought up another thing. Blum brought up that Kohberger circles the house 3 times. And yes, I'm going to get to that store clerk who, in my mind, helped crack this case, who you say wants to remain anonymous, and I don't blame her. Long story short, how did you confirm, Howard Blum, that a white Elantra or car similar to a white Elantra circled the King Road address 3 times leading up to the quadruple murder? How did you confirm that?
Well, part of it is in court documents and the public affidavits, but I also spoke with the gas station attendant who gave the surveillance video to the police too. So a lot of that is public record. What is not public record, clearly, is what was in the driver's mind at that time as he was circling. Something you have to remember, in all the surveillance videos, there's not one photograph of the license plate of the car. There's not one photograph of the driver. You can't see who it is holding the steering wheel. The FBI has tried everything to try to pull a picture from inside the car of who was driving that night, and they couldn't. So, but Kohberger, I believe, was the man in that Hyundai Elantra, and he was trying to find the will to cross over into the man who was thinking about this horrific crime to becoming the sort of man who could commit it. And it was a difficult, difficult journey he was taking internally that night.
Families of the slain Idaho 4 victims await justice as a judge sets a date for trial.
Yeah, and that judge, many argue, is kowtowing to the defense. When are these families going to get justice? That's a whole other can of worms. With me, Howard Blum, the author of an incredible new book, When the Night Comes Falling, a requiem for the Idaho student murders. Okay, all hands on deck to analyze what Howard Blum is telling us. Now, Howard Blum, you crossed over into the gas station video, which is later, when I believe Kohberger's leaving the scene. I'm going to go back to you stating in your book that you believe Kohberger, a white Elantra, circles the crime scene 3 times that we know of before the murders occur. Now, not the gas station video. You are telling me that's caught on video. Is it, as you describe at the end, near the end of chapter 20, a guy who owns a rental complex, I think 3 apartments, a rental complex nearby, and he's got a camera on top of the rental complex looking down? Did his video catch the Elantra circling 3 times before the murders?
Yes, and in this video too, they still can't make out a license plate. They still can't make out in the darkness the driver, but they are able to make out the car. When the FBI in Quantico is trying to figure out from these videos what kind of car it is, they try 3 different times until they finally come up with a Hyundai Elantra from 2011 to 2015. At first, they thought it was just 2011 to 2013. And that's one of the reasons why Bryan Kohberger takes so long to find him, because the authorities in Washington state were really looking for the wrong car.
Hey, just got Morgan, and everybody jump in. I'm going to circle back to you, Brian Stewart, about mens rea, about intent. Is it even needed? Do we need explicit intent, or is it implicit by the number of the killings that we have murder ones, of course we do. But I want to talk to you about the legal theory. Before that, Joe Scott Morgan, you hear Howard Blum describing 3 times he's circled that we know of. And it's caught, I believe, on the top of that rental facility. There's a camera up on the roof. And I looked everywhere when I was out there, Joe Scott Morgan. I went very slowly, and it was slippery and icy. And I fell more than once. I looked all the way up and down the street for surveillance videos. It's very narrow. I've told you this story. I could stand on one side of the street, look into the kitchen window across the street, and tell you what kind of liquid soap they had sitting on their sink at the kitchen window. It's that close. I did not see the overhead surveillance camera on that rental. It's on the roof. It's incredible. Now, he was talking about the FBI tried everything to enhance the tag and the driver. How? What did they do to enhance?
They're washing this thing through various programs that they have, Nancy, in order to try to tighten down the image, because I'm sure that it's very granulated, particularly given the nighttime status of this, where you're not going to be able to pick up, without some kind of light enhancement, like an infrared or something like this, that'll be able to give you finer detail. So it's going to be greatly compromised. And look, you have to think about the house itself. This house is kind of shaded in darkness from the rear. You're not going to see a lot there. There's not a lot. It's not like being in a huge city where you've got street lights that are all over the place that'll be illuminating this environment. So it's going to be a tough ask if you're thinking about attempting to get an image that's capturable, so that they can do what they need to do in order to identify this individual.
Okay, Joe Scott, just please stop. You know what?
Yep.
I can see a tiny little crater on the moon, but I can't get the tag number or the visage of Kohberger's face. Why?
Because these houses don't have the Hubble telescope on them. These
Nobody likes a smart aleck or a know-it-all, Joe Scott.
Well,
You're
these
right.
cameras,
You're right.
the cameras that you're talking about, they're not the highest of quality. I mean, look how many are turned out every single day. They're in shops all over the place. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a great quality.
Did Bryan Kohberger's parents suspect their son? An explosive new book suggests family knew more than they ever let on about their troubled son. Author Howard Blum tells us more.
His book is so chock full of evidence and facts supporting what many of us have been thinking and pondering, and so much more. When the Night Comes Falling by Howard Blum. Howard, we were just talking to Joe Scott Morgan about why the FBI could not enhance that video better than it did. I get it, but I heard you saying something in the background. What was that?
Well, not only couldn't they enhance the video, the FBI has this program that they developed really for anti-terrorism activities. And they tried 3 different times to analyze the car, and they got 3 different years. Originally, the car was not a Hyundai Elantra. They made it a Nissan Sentra. And then finally, there was a 2011, and then a 2013. And then they finally, at the end, said 2011 to 2015. I can assure you, the FBI's fumblings will come up in court. I'm sure the defense will raise this and try to impugn the identification of the car.
Okay, wait a minute. The FBI fumbling? I don't see them fumbling here. What do you mean by that?
Well, fumbling in the sense that their technology was just not up to snuff, and they gave declarations. The first original be on the lookout notice was not for a 2015 Hyundai Elantra. It was for a 2011 Hyundai Elantra.
Okay, hold on, Howard Blum. Hold on, Howard Blum. You mentioned a detail, and I'm not sure if you thought I was just going to ignore it or didn't catch it, but you said the FBI was trying to enhance. They tried it 3 times, I believe you said, But are you referring to the type of video surveillance that was ultimately introduced in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, where we had satellite surveillance from nearly 9,000 feet in the air to figure out what really happened? And there was video. Did the FBI go to the extent of grabbing sat video?
This was much more rudimentary. What they had was the surveillance photographs, and they tried to enhance it. These were grainy photographs, and they thought they run them through this machine, this process, this computer program that was developed at vast expense by the Department of Defense and Homeland Security originally for terrorism activities, and they thought they could get the identity of the car. And then they passed it out in their original Be on the Lookout at the Moscow police sent nationwide for a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra. That was a mistake. That wasn't the year of the car they ultimately decided was Kohberger's.
Guys, we are speaking to an all-star panel, including author Howard Blum, who has just finished his book, When the Night Comes Falling, A Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. To my panel, I want to thank you for kindly agreeing to join us again tomorrow night, because we've barely scratched the surface of the evidence, how it was accumulated, and what does it mean with Howard Blum. For instance, have we found a receipt for the outfit Bryan Kohberger purchased and wore during the murders? There's so much more. Please join us tomorrow night with the same all-star panel, including Howard Blum, as we, like the investigators, comb through the Kohberger evidence. But now we stop and we remember an American hero. American hero, Reserve Corporal Joseph Johnson, Nyssa, Oregon Police Department. Corporal Johnson shot and killed in the line of duty. He is survived by a grieving wife and 2 beautiful children. American hero, Corporal Joseph Johnson. Thank you to our guests for being with us tonight and illuminating the mysterious facts surrounding a quadruple murder of 4 beautiful students. Thank you for joining us, and to our MSM family as we search for the truth that will hopefully result in a true verdict. Nancy Grace signing off. I'll see you tomorrow night, 6 and 9 o'clock sharp Eastern, and until then, good night, friend. Guys, thank you for watching Crime Online with Nancy Grace here on YouTube. To get the very latest, subscribe to Crime Online here